By July 1987, public hysteria over child abuse had paralysed Cleveland social services, the police and the courts.
We were presenting the public with something which they didn't want to hear about. They didn't want to know. It was too difficult, too demanding, too threatening. It made people feel fearful and it made them go on the defensive. If the cases had been dealt with in a calmer atmosphere and environment, it's likely, in my opinion, that on the balance of probabilities, it would have been held that abuse had occurred and more active steps taken to protect the children.
On July the 7th, Middlesbrough MP Stuart Bell held a televised press conference announcing he was to deliver to government ministers a dossier detailing the cases of 19 families.
This report, which I have before me, is an indictment of certain individuals within the health service and an indictment of certain individuals within the social services. What I am asking the Minister to do is to have a full inquiry into all aspects of this affair.
I am worried about the political power that seemed to be wielded in the Cleveland crisis, and I find that very frightening. I find that personally frightening, that our work can be so interfered with.
But how accurate was the information in Mr. Bell's dossier? Of the 19 families he supported, 7 included children who had already disclosed abuse. 3 included an adult male who had already been charged with sexual abuse, and 2 more involved families where the father was a convicted child sex offender.
That really shakes me. I had no knowledge of that. I knew that the dossier was to be presented. Indeed, I did ask Stuart if I could have a copy. He refused. He said that I could look at the cases which originated in my constituency. I pointed out to him that, according to parliamentary protocol, I should indeed be handling them. He refused to divulge any details on any of those cases.
But if Mr. Bell kept his dossier secret from his fellow MPs, he publicised it widely and lobbied hard on behalf of the parents. He wrote to the parents of a family code-lettered AF whose children had been taken into care.
No one would wish your children to be separated from their parents.
In fact, the father had already been cautioned by the police for hitting the children, and a team of independent experts had concluded that separation was the only way to protect these children from their parents.
I don't understand why Stuart Bell would choose to support adults who are accused of abusing their children without being very sure himself of whether or not the children were abused. I think somebody like my father going to an MP would very probably have come across as being very plausible and being the victim instead of the perpetrator.
2 days after Mr. Bell presented his dossier, the government announced a judicial inquiry.
Mr. Speaker, I will, with permission, make a statement about child abuse in Cleveland. We have concluded that there should be a full inquiry into the arrangements for dealing with suspected cases of child abuse in Cleveland, headed by a High Court judge.
The inquiry, under Lord Justice Butler Sloss, began hearings in August. At the same time, courts in Cleveland were still hearing several of the cases. Amongst those giving evidence to both was Cleveland's senior police surgeon. Dr. Alistair Irvine had sparked the crisis by denouncing RAD as an indicator of sexual abuse, but at the inquiry he made a startling U-turn.
There is one thing I want to clarify, madam. Although I do not consider anal dilatation in itself to be diagnostic, I do accept that it is suspicious, that it is an indicator to investigate further.
But if the police surgeon's opposition to RAD was now in doubt, the inquiry seemed powerless to pass this on to the courts.
A clear decision was made by Butler Sloss at the beginning of the inquiry that nothing that was said in the inquiry should be relayed to the High Court, that one set of proceedings should not be allowed to influence the other.
Nor was it only Dr. Irvin's evidence that was kept within the inquiry.
On occasion, parents gave conflicting and inconsistent evidence in the inquiry and in the High Court, but only those of us that were present knew about that. The High Court wasn't allowed to know that perhaps some parents might have incriminated themselves or said things that were inconsistent with what they were being told in that other setting.
And the central question, whether the 121 children had been abused, was never on the Butler Sloss inquiry's agenda.
The inquiry wasn't set up to look at the cases. It was to look at the management of the cases. I think very many of us really wanted to tell the inquiry a lot of things about the children. I wanted to tell the inquiry how it was for the children, not just what they said about abuse, but what they were going through. And that didn't seem to be relevant at all.
But detailed information on each of the 121 children was presented to the inquiry, in secret. Cleveland County Council drew up a computerized database on all the children.
The purpose of the database was to collate information for the subsequent Butler Sloss inquiry of all of the details of children referred to the Social Services Department for suspected forms of abuse. I examined most of the files of the children involved, and there was definite evidence that various forms of abuse were suspected before referral either to doctors or to anyone else.
The inquiry report criticised the paediatricians and social services management of the crisis, the police surgeons for dismissing RAD, and MP Stuart Bell for inflaming public opinion with unsupported allegations. It said nothing about the children themselves.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I wish to make a statement about the report by Lord Justice Butler Sloss on the findings of her inquiry into the handling of suspected child abuse cases.
On July the 6th, 1988, Health Minister Tony Newton told the House of Commons that some children remained wards of court, but there was no verdict on how many had been abused.
The report I have in front of me says we understand that out of the 121 children, those are the children diagnosed by Doctors Higgs and Wyatt, 98 are now at home.
I think at the time that statement was made, it was true that 96 children had been returned home to their families, but the majority of them were subject to High Court orders of one sort or another, or restrictions in some instances were placed on certain members of the family not to have contact with them, or they were under the supervision of the Social Services Department.
What do those restrictions imply to you?
Well, it implied that the court felt there was a case to answer at that time, and that the children might well be at risk and needed to be protected.
The Department of Health also received independent evidence suggesting that the majority of the children had been abused. Independent panels set up to give second opinions on the diagnoses by Doctors Higgs and Wyatt reported the paediatricians had been correct in at least 70 to 75% of the cases.
I only learned of this report about 2.5 weeks ago. And I've got to tell you that I was greatly pleased to learn of it. I wasn't privy to its existence, let alone its contents. Had we known then, I think it would have made a major difference, not only to the Children's Act, which came about later, but also to that debate specifically.
The public has not had the information put before it. It's my belief that it has been actively withheld and concealed. If the truth were known, then I think Cleveland would be an even greater scandal than people already imagine it to be. The scandal would be that children were not protected from severe, horrendous abuse.
Instead, parents have ever since been given license to attack the paediatricians and social workers.
Now, 7 years ago, parents throughout the country were stunned when hundreds of allegations of child abuse were revealed in the county of Cleveland within a few weeks.
This couple used a BBC chat show to complain of being kept from their son.
He could be watching now. What do you want to say to him?
Which camera are we on?
That one there.
Wherever you are, if you're watching this, and your friends, I want you to know one thing: your family love you very dearly. Come home and get away from those very evil people who got you in captivity.
The truth about this man is that he's been convicted of sexual assaults on a young girl and that a High Court judge ruled he had repeatedly buggered his son, sometimes in front of his wife.
It was like being in Alice in Wonderland or Alice through the looking glass, that nothing made sense anymore and you never knew what was going to happen next.
2 years after the crisis, Cleveland County Council checked its records to follow up on the 121 children. Despite the disputed medical evidence, courts had ruled 93 of the children had been at risk of abuse. Only 28 had been sent home, either with a ruling that no abuse had taken place or with no conditions attached. The council found that many of the children had since been re-referred to its social services department.
We found, in fact, 25 of the children had been referred, and of those 5 had been re-referred for sexual abuse. From what I knew of the families in 1987, the re-referrals didn't surprise me at all. And some of the indications with the families, there was very strong evidence that various forms of abuse had occurred to some of the children. And it was no surprise to me at all that in 1989, some of them had been re-referred to the department.
The council sent details of the re-referrals to the Department of Health, but then a joint decision was taken that no further follow-up was to be carried out on the Cleveland children. All records relating to them as a group were destroyed.
I'm astonished and dumbfounded, and frankly, I shall try, out of charity, to try to find some kind of justification within logic which might warrant that decision. I don't know who took it. I know all the principals who were involved in it. If I ever find out who took it and I meet them again, they'll have a piece of my mind.
It was quite deliberately designed that nobody would know and nobody would find out. There were no arrangements made for follow-up. The data has become scattered and dispersed, and I think that those children have been sacrificed.
I believe that the children that I saw, with the medical evidence to show that they were abused. Yes, I still believe that. I believe that more now than I did at the time, if anything, because I know how it works now. I know what silences children. I know how they feel.
The fate of the 121 Cleveland children remains a secret. Child protection workers who tried to speak for them have been silenced. In 1990, Cleveland County Council made Sue Richardson redundant. Last week, she resigned from her job at the NCH Action for Children charity after it told her she risked dismissal for taking part in this film.
Cleveland has left a legacy of fear, a climate of fear and anxiety, that if you stick your neck out on behalf of abused children and they need adults to do that for them, then you just might get your own head blown off.
Dr. Alistair Irvine and MP Stuart Bell declined to be interviewed for this film. Geoffery Wyatt is still working as a paediatrician in Cleveland, but is banned from any child abuse cases. Last year, an internal inquiry by his health trust concluded the ban puts a small number of children at risk. The ban remains in force. Marietta Higgs was never allowed to return to Cleveland. Earlier this year, she was appointed paediatrician at Dumfries Infirmary. Her health trust told her it did not want her to take part in this film. The trust said it feared the public response.
My understanding of the Cleveland crisis was basically that in the same way that I was being told to be quiet and keep it secret and not tell, I was aware that Marietta Higgs was being called a liar and that she was being made to be quiet and to keep secrets by the adults who had more power over her.
2 years ago, Ruth's father was jailed for 7 years for abusing her throughout her childhood. During the trial, defence barristers tried to persuade the jury Ruth's allegations could not be believed because she came from Cleveland.